Okay, so the next game is King Phillips War. And here it's enactment of, what is it, the colonial war between the natives and the colonists in the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth Colony, Rhode Island, Connecticut, etc., against one another. The natives sparked this off, but it really is a sign of the decline of whatever power they had in the area. And this is, what, 1675, 1676, covering a few, at a very light level, kind of an attempt to take a look at the history of this. One thing to note, the apparently somehow bad press or whatever reflected on this, and the native community was up in arms about the game at one point. It's kind of a shame, because by exploring things like this, I think we get a better idea of what's actually happening. I had a native friend who was unhappy with ever playing Geronimo because, hey, you know, it's just about the decimation of the societies. Well, unlike Geronimo in this, it's a game where the natives could actually win, and they could actually turn history around. And in both cases, I think it's important to be aware of our history in a way that maybe our schools don't really give us to the correct degree. And I don't feel like this is a game which is particularly biased in any sense at all. It's an attempt at a light simulation of the situation going on. Anyway, that said, let's take a look at this. I saw Hello Gregor's review of it, and it's impressive as always, but doesn't go into a lot of the meat of the details of it. And in my intro, I'm going to go into that, as I always do. And then when I come back for a review, I'll give my feelings on the game. This is a first look at the game. He played a number of games to get that kind of essence of it that he provides in his. Let's take a look at what the rules are like. Now, initially, you have a situation where you have three native tribes, nations, I'm not sure. The Wampanoags, and I'm going to mispronounce everybody's name here because I'm really terrible with that, with everything. The Sacadettes and the Pocasets, who are unhappy about the situation with this encroachment. They're limiting their land size more and more and more. And it's obvious that if they don't turn and do something at this point, they will never have a chance. Unfortunately, probably their day to have done something actually has passed already. But it's still possible within this game. Let's see what we've got here. So, we got a nice little player aid chart. Double-sided. There's actually two of them. The other one I've got over here in my box. One for each player. It's a two-player game, kind of using a light point-to-point movement system. You'll notice one thing, most point-to-point systems these days come with a deck of cards. Well, this one doesn't. And that's kind of refreshing. It does come with this kind of weird die, which we're going to see. It takes effect in battle and generates a lot of events that otherwise the game would probably be kind of flavorless without the cards, without a set of event charts or something like that. So this is the mechanism by which it's going to give a little bit more flavor than just a simple point-to-point system. It also has some other little oddities to it from other point-to-point systems. So here's our sequence of play, and we actually have that copied over here on the chart. The first thing you do in each turn is you make a roll to see if Benjamin Church rises to some sort of military prominence within the colonies. And once he does, he's going to be able to allow the colonies to work better together and also adopt some of the native tactics which, given the nature of the war, were really kind of necessary. They couldn't come in with European tactics in this wilderness land area. Now, the way that works is on the first 6 turns, you roll a die at the beginning of each turn. And if you roll the turn number or less, you get Church on as one of your leaders. A little bit of worry about this, which is, one, the game states, if you want a more competitive game, just set it at 3. I also have a question whether or not it's a more historical game if you just set it at 3. Because in fact, if the colonists aren't getting beaten, they actually probably wouldn't turn to these more radical thoughts. But there's not really a good way of simulating that. Turn 3 doesn't really fix that in place. I would rather see something that said, if the victory point balance is going the wrong way, then you'd roll a die or something. But that's not what we're seeing here. So I don't see a difference between rolling 1 on the first turn and 1 through 2 on the second turn, etc. And just getting them on the third turn, or in terms of adding extra historical realism to the game. The additional rules, the optional rules in most games generally add more historical veracity. In this case, I'm not convinced that they do. There's no real selling point on that, and we'll go to them as well. All right, let's take a look. Let's take a little look at the board before we go further in the sequence of play, actually. What do we have on the board? Well, we have these circles, which are just spaces. They're not important. They're just territory, right? They don't count for anything in terms of victory points. But then we have the white circles, which are native settlements. We have red circles, which are colonial settlements. And then we have the hexagons, which represent forts. Somewhat more defended settlements, if you wish. All right. We have an interesting little factor, which is these connections are marked by these pips. And those pips are going to be the movement cost to move over those connections. And we'll see how that works in a moment. And we also have river connections. And the territories that are connected by rivers are marked with a little, very faint, I think you can see it, blue circle around them. You have ports, which are ocean-going ports. You'll see they go quite far up into the bay. Narragansett Bay. And I think that's about it for terrain in this game. All right. So going back to the sequence play. So once church is in the game, the colonists can roll for allied Indians. Or if you prefer the term natives, but they use Indians in here. That's the term that was used, mistakenly or not, by the colonists. You roll a die at the start of each turn, and you subtract 1 for every 2 Indian villages raised. If you get a 1 or less, you get 1 allied native. We use these markers until you run out of them. And those are just extra strength points that you'll have. And they have an advantage in that they can help you travel on rivers if they're with your company. Okay, then we go to reinforcements. First the English get reinforcements. Now, none in the first turn, but each colony produces a number of soldiers each turn. And this is also the time that you'll get any lost leaders that you have, any lost captains or whatever that are put on the turn track. And this is the turn track here. This is the victory point track up the top, as well as for provisions lost, which really marks how many villages or settlements or whatever you've destroyed. It's not a pleasant war, I'm afraid. Okay. Then we go to the Indian diplomacy. Now here, the native player is allowed to, if he's matched a certain number of settlements that he's raised of the colonists, go to a particular tribe, and he just sort of teleports over there with one of his units and try to convince them to join the war. Now, it's automatic actually in most cases. The one exception to that is the Mohawks up here, which historically Philip, who has his own name, but Philip was the name he's known by the Europeans, and his father presented him as such to them. He went there and tried to convince them, and they ambushed him with a war party. It was meddling where the New York State governor, who's not really in the game, was also trying to recruit the Mohawks at the same time. All right, then we go to Indian reinforcements, which is going to work pretty much the same way as the colonial one does. You get a certain number per turn. Now, there's a slight difference, though. Colonial troops are always replaced. If you kill colonial troops, they go back in the force pool, and they can come back as reinforcements. The natives had a smaller population base and didn't have the resources to call on from Europe. So as their units die, they're put in the eliminated units box. For the most part, once they produce all their reinforcements, they're done. They will not get more. So they're limited by their countermix as sort of a one-time use. Now the next thing we hit is Indian movement and combat. Let me explain how movement and combat works in this game, and then I'll explain some slight differences that the colonists have. Now, the way movement works is you're limited to a certain number of stacks that you can move. And stacking is basically you're allowed 2 units in a space, two either warrior units or troop units, unless you have a leader, in which case you're allowed 3. Units can be counted as either full strength, in which case there's 2 strength points on them, or half strength, in which case there's 1. And there's a step loss factor in between there. Now, the way movement works is you can select a certain number of your stacks which you're allowed to move. And the Indians, it's always 5 of their stacks that they're allowed to move. And then they're allowed to move them a certain number of movement points. And that depends, let's see what, if we have this. Their base is 6 pips of movement. Now, there are some things that can factor into that and affect how many movement pips you can move across. For example, if you have a spy or a guide with you, spies subtract from your movement. They're a penalty. They're the enemy's spies in your camp. Guides add to your movement rating. And what is it? You're allowed a base of 6, so you'd be able to cross that many pips. Counted in that is if you wanted to play a battle counter at the end of your movement, you could, let's take an example here that might happen, play one across a line. So for example, let's say the Pocasets are attacking Taunton. They could play a battle marker there. That indicates they're moving into there. It's very similar to the mechanism in most of these point-to-point games where you actually move into the space to attack it. Well, here, you're not allowed to move into the space to attack it, but this helps represent where you came from and where you're attacking it the same way, in a kind of nice way. At first I thought it was, not really adding anything, but I'm coming to the conclusion that it does because you're allowed to move more than 1 stack at a time. In most of these point-to-point, especially the card-driven games, you activate 1 stack, use it. It's pretty obvious where you came from. But here, you're activating 5 stacks. It could be, quite a bit of memorization going on as to, hey, where did he come from? Now, of course, without these markers, you could just place yourself moving in, and that would probably be sufficient as well. All right. But still, the concept of moving across, of being in action at the snapshot before combat is taken, is the important one. Whether or not you use the battle markers doesn't really matter. One advantage to the battle markers is that you flip them over as they're done. I'm not sure what that does. Lets you know what's been completed already. I don't know how important that is. All right. Maybe easier to reconstruct things. So that's what you do during movement. Now during combat is sort of an interesting factor. So let me go back to the English player's movement special rules here. For the English player, before he gets church, he's only allowed to move 3 companies, only up to 5 pips. He can't use anything but 1 pip combinations. He can't use rivers. Now I haven't explained rivers, but rivers work just like other connections for the most part. Retreating and withdrawal and interception don't apply, but for the most part, they count like normal things, except they're only a half pip, which is huge for the natives at the beginning of the game. And once the colonists start to use that, while they can't use it with all those stacks, some of them will be able to. And they're only allowed to place 3 battle markers. Now you'll notice one thing, they're only allowed to move 3 stacks, they're only allowed to place 3 battle markers. That matches actually perfectly. You can't declare multiple battles from 1 stack. It's a single movement, right? Okay. So let's go. Then after church, they're allowed to move 5 companies. They still are limited to 5 pips total, but they can use the larger connections. They can use ocean movement in both cases. Ocean movement just takes your entire movement and moves you from one ocean port to another, which can be very valuable. Here you can see the Connecticut connection. Hey, there's my hometown. The Connecticut connection allows you to basically move to New London, which you wouldn't be able to get to otherwise. One thing you see is some map anomalies that are kind of disturbing once you start looking at it. For example, when you look here at this little circle, it kind of bugs me because from here, I can go to here or here, okay? But I can't go beyond them, which almost indicates that these should be somehow connected. Maybe the terrain is being represented better than I think it is here, but it's kind of a problem with point-to-point systems. I feel like area systems can really express, okay, this is why you can't move across here. I don't understand why I can't make one of these crosses. Because I'm looking at it geometrically and saying, wait a minute, why aren't they connected? This isn't really a ring. I don't know enough about that terrain. There's obviously a little bit of mountain here when you look at the map, but it doesn't look like it should be that much of an issue. We'll see. All right. Let's go to combat. So in combat itself, you go through a series of steps. The first is you're allowed to evade combat. Now we're going to need to look up the roll for that because... Okay. So the base roll for this is you need a 5 or higher for Indians, a 7 or higher for English. It's on 1 6-sided die, so that's going to be hard for the English, except there's bonuses. +1 for a leader, +2 if it's a key leader, and then the guide spy combination, which is always there. Right now you're saying guide spies, where do they come from? Just wait. They're on the event die. Okay. If the defender successfully evades, he moves to a space that he's already identified before the evasion attempt that's safe to escape to. And there's some constraints to that, but we'll move on. Okay. Then what happens is the attacker rolls all 3 dice. Okay. And the first thing to check is that these aren't doubles. If those were doubles, there was no battle. Something intervened, weather, leadership inability, whatever happened, the battle just didn't happen. So whatever your plans are, you may fail to even engage. Beyond that, if a player already has a spy allocated against him, that spy can be discarded by the enemy player to force a reroll of any one of the 3 dice. Yep. And if you have a guide with you, you can force a reroll with your own force that you're using. You can discard him to force a reroll of any one of the 3 dice. If at any time you end up at doubles, the battle just doesn't happen, which means the more spies and guides and stuff that are used in a battle, the more likely the battle's just not going to happen. The more tricky things become maneuvering-wise, the more likely it's just going to be a standoff. Okay, the next thing you do is you want to look at the event die. And there's a number of different symbols on here. The first one is an ambush. Now, only one player has to be selected as the affected player with these events. And in this case, Well, in the game's case, the affected player is based on the total of these dice. If it's even, it affects the English. If it's odd, it affects the Indians. Now, there's something kind of interesting there. Any doubles is going to be even, which means that events are going to be more likely to affect the Indians than they are the English. Something to keep in mind. I don't know if that was intended, but it's clearly the case. It's not mentioned in fairly extensive design notes, which is just a bonus, but they went more into other things than the game design. Okay, what happens in an ambush? Well, the affected guy has been bushwhacked, and the other guy gets to do his combat results first. Next is a spy. What that means is the affected player is going to have a spy added to his camp, and that'll benefit his opponent until that spy gets either killed through the entire force being wiped out, or the spy ends up discarded to re-roll a die. And we see the extent of the spy's abilities, including a minus in combat. Emergency reinforcements. They just give you an extra strength point for this combat only to the affected player, just indicating that you were able to maybe fight a little harder or raise up some extra troops. Massacre. The affected player gets a full strength infantry in a friendly village or settlement. The battle was just so, vile that it rallied your cause, and you're going to get extra troops from it on the board. Now, this, I believe, this can come from the eliminated units box, which means the Indian can actually get additional units this way. That's a huge bonus, I guess. Panic. Some of the affected player's forces have panicked. The non-affected player chooses one enemy unit, village, or settlement, or fort, and it's excluded from the combat there. You probably want to pick a stronger unit to reduce the strength more. And finally, there's a guide. This works very much like the spy. Again, I believe it requires a leader to be present, but if there is a leader present in the player's stack, they get this additional spy or guide. And that'll come into play at the end of the battle. All right. To determine your losses, well, we have a list of all the things you add up. Your warriors, your leaders give bonuses, at least your key leader. Musket markers. For the Indians, they have these musket markers that they can assign to their war bands. As they appear, they have to assign them along the river spaces, though. They can't just, or maybe it's a port. Let's look that one up. River or ocean port. Yeah, so they have to put it someplace where it could have been snuck into them. Okay. And that's going to give a +1. Villages and settlements give a +1 as long as they haven't been raided. Forts give a +2 or a +1 if they're damaged. And the spy gives a -1. The guide doesn't give you a bonus in combat, but the spy gives you a minus. And what you do is you cross-reference the amount of strength points you have, add it up from here, against the die roll of your color, red for the colonists, green for the Indians, and that's how much damage you did. Whoever does the most damage wins the battle. The losses are picked by the affected player in this case, and you can take losses by flipping a unit over for a step loss or removing the unit completely for the second step loss. Villages, settlements, and forts use these little damage markers, so you can raid a village and then eventually raise it. And everything costs pretty much 1. Now when a fort is raised, the attacking player gets a victory point. When a village or Indian fort is raised, the English player receives a victory point, and the Indian player loses provisions. And there's these provision lost markers, which track how many things have been burnt down, basically. Alright. And likewise, when an English fort is raised, the Indian player receives a victory point, and the English player loses provisions, or a settlement for that matter. And that's handled the same way. I'm going to come back in a little bit, because I'm out of video. Okay, so now, if the last unit in a battle is removed, and there's a leader or a captain present, well, that leader or captain, or key leader for that matter, is killed or wounded or something. In the case of the unnamed leaders, they produce a victory point and merely move, or will be available 2 turns later in the reinforcement phase. In the case of the key leaders, it's a little more devastating. First of all, it's a 2 victory point penalty that goes to your opponent, but also on a 4 through 6, no, on a 1 through 3, the leader's dead and won't be coming back. On a 4 through 6, they come back as though they were a regular leader. Now, if you lose both your key leaders, and both sides have 2, Philip and Connecticut for the natives, and Connecticut comes in with the Narragansetts, I believe. Does that seem to make sense? I don't remember. And that's what I would guess, but oh, they're purple. Yeah, I think the color may be wrong on them. I'm not sure. I think they're this blue pile here, the dark blue. I'm having trouble focusing. I'm not terribly well right now. So where are the purples? If they were the blues, I don't know. I'll have to, let's see what it says here. These are a little mistaken, though, is the problem. The Narragansetts are purple, but there is no real purple. Yeah, those are the Meantics, which I can't find on the map. I find the choice of the, up here, Neantics. I find the choice of the colors and the way of displaying them difficult. My brain's not processing that well. The white with the color band's just not settling into my brain very well. Such is, right? We know my brain doesn't work well. Okay, so anyway, once all of a tribe or colony, well, there's 2 things. Once all of a tribe or colony's settlements are destroyed, they will no longer produce reinforcements of any kind, and that includes their leaders. But they continue to fight on. But a tribe can surrender. If the English victory point marker goes up high enough on the track to meet these color markers, those tribes will withdraw from the battle. And you'll see the one that comes in the latest in the game is the most likely to drop in. It's hard, or no, the least likely to drop out. In particular, though, the earlier ones are more likely to fall to the expected victory point losses. As you go further and further into the battle, though, and in some cases you'll see, like the Narragansetts come in very early, but they're willing to stick in for the long haul. And there are some that are simply unwilling to leave. The initial starting ones, I believe, will not leave the battle. They're in no matter what. I don't know. Sakonets will fall out, as will the Pokasets, but there may be some that won't. We know the Wampanoags will not leave, even though these were closely allied to them. Okay. So, if tribal surrender is achieved, if the victory points for the colonists get high enough, then that tribe is actually removed. All its pieces are removed from the board, but they're put aside in the same with the same numbers, same eliminated units, etc. Because if the colonists decide to attack that tribe again, they will bring it in, and they will bring it in for the rest of the game. It will not drop out again. Okay. There's also a rule on the Connecticut-New York border conflict. Once Connecticut has started to have raised settlements, the Indian player can choose to roll a die, and if he rolls less than or equal to the number of Connecticut raised settlements, he's brought about an event between Connecticut and New York, and I think he just gets 3 victory points. I can't imagine why you'd want to do this early. It doesn't seem to have any additional effect in the game, so you'd probably want to do it at the latest point you possibly can. You have to choose to do it now. You have to choose to do it once you just raised a settlement. So, if you start losing the war, you may want to make one last gasp to try to exploit that situation and get a few more victory points. So I was mistaken there too. Alright. And what's all this? Why does this go? We're still in the battle rules. We just kind of... And the rules kind of do this. They jump around. They're not the best rules in the world, but they're not the worst either. Alright. So then after you defeat... If you completely defeat the enemy, and there's nothing there, no village, no troops there, the attacker can advance into it, maintaining his stacking limitations. Remember, that's like 2 pieces, or 3 if he has a leader. And then you get some victory points, and those are a victory point for each enemy warrior completely defeated, i.e. put in the eliminated box or back in the tray. 1 for each enemy settlement or village raised, 1 for each fort raised, 1 for each leader lost, 2 if it's a key leader. And then some of the events for the event die roll come into play here, like the guides or the spies. They get placed at this point. Now, Phase 9, Winter Attrition, happens only in 1 turn. There's 1 winter turn. And winter affects 2 things. It affects movement. Let's jump back to movement and see what it does there. In the case of winter turn, the 1 turn, all movement costs for pips are doubled. There's also a restriction that you're only allowed to play 3 battle markers during the winter turn. Okay, but in addition to that, there's winter attrition, where you count the number of raised settlements, which is going to be marked by the provisions lost marker. Settlements, forts, whatever. And for every 2 that the Indians have raised, the English player has to remove a full-strength soldier. And likewise, for every 2 that the colonists have raised, the Indian must remove a full-strength warrior. Now, these, in both cases, even with the Indians, don't go into the eliminated units box. They go into the tray, which means they can come back as reinforcements or replacements or whatever you want to call them. If you don't have enough full-strength units, you go to half-strength units, and whatever. On Phase 10, you determine whether or not somebody's gotten an automatic victory, and if not, then you keep going until turn 9. Now, an automatic victory comes from 2 ways. If either player reaches 30 victory points, the game is over at the end of the turn, unless they're tied. 30 or more, right? And it's also over if both Philip and Canachet are dead, or on the game turn track. They don't even have to be dead, they can just be removed from battle. It doesn't matter that Canachet is not in the battle to begin with, not in the war at the beginning. But once he's in, he can be part of. It's possible for the game to end this way. The Indians win 30 victory points. I may have misled you. I thought that losing Church and Winslow would lose the colonists the game. It's not the case. It's that it's raising Boston and Plymouth, and that would be pretty severe, I think. If you can get both of them out, you've pretty much destroyed the two colonies for the most part. And some kind of settlement could become too. That might break the back of New England, essentially. If the game goes all the way through and nobody has an automatic victory, whoever has the most victory points wins. If they're tied, the side which lost the fewest total villages, settlements, or forts wins. And again, that's going to be marked with those provisions lost markers. If there's a tie in automatic victory, then it goes to a tiebreaker as well. Whoever lost the least wins. There are some optional rules. There's a shorter version, which makes it only a 5-turn game. That looks pretty weak to me, but could be interesting, I guess. Some optional rules: disunited colonies, which prevents the colonies from leaving their own territory. Now, they have a restriction which I didn't mention. They can't stack with one another. I didn't really mention this about anything. Nobody can really stack with one another. Let's take a look at the stacking limitations here, because we haven't really looked at it. Yeah, you're required to stack only with your own colony or tribe. But there are ways of breaking that based on the key leaders. All warriors with white, yellow, or green are Wampanoag, essentially. They're so allied that they're allowed to stack together. Let's see what else we have. Church is allowed. Once he comes in, he allows colonists to stack with other colonies' forces. Philip and Canochet can also combine warriors from different tribes in their own stack only. And it doesn't matter about settlements, villages, and forts. You can garrison or defend a place with another force. You just can't have their units together. All right. Now let's go back to the optional rules, I guess. There's these unlimited and limited ferocity. Unlimited ferocity is basically you can do 2 rounds of battle instead of 1. I don't know if this is terribly more historical or not. And then limited ferocity is the same as long as it's a key leader leading the force. Again, there's not enough description in the game about these options to make me decide, is that a more historical option or not? I suspect, but I don't know enough about the history, but I suspect that these are actually gameplay twisters. They're trying to make the game a little bit more active because maybe some players didn't like feeling as constrained as they did. And it may be kind of historically neutral in the sense that we don't really, there's no good reason to choose one way or the other. Or it may not. And I feel like chances are they took the more historical version since there's no real complexity added here. So I can only imagine that, like the disunited colonies, it's kind of a, if you want to try playing something a little different. It's not clear in the description, though, which way that goes. There's a little bit of a history of the game itself. You'd think this is where the designer's notes would go. A little bit. Mainly it's the history of what's going on. And then a little bit of the history of the game. The fact that, there was some outcry about this. People probably not realize, thinking it was going to be something kind of ugly. It's not. It's a standard war game. War games simulate warfare, which is not a pleasant subject, but if we don't know that piece of history at all, we're kind of blind to it, and the more light you can shed on it, the better. And then there's this extended example of play, which of course I didn't look at, but that's helpful to some people, I think. I actually scanned it a little bit. Anyway, that's what we got. I'll load this up, and we'll start playing.